The room was quiet in that way only a courtroom can be. Not peaceful, not calm, just heavy. Every cough sounded too loud. Every shuffle of shoes echoed longer than it should have. I stood there with my hands clasped in front of me, eyes forward, trying not to look at anyone for too long. I had been in many intimidating places before, but nothing felt quite like this moment. Because I knew something no one else in that room did. And in just a few seconds, everything was about to change. The judge lifted his eyes from the file in front of him, ready to begin like he had done thousands of times before. His posture was confident, practiced. This was his courtroom. His rules. He had seen every kind of person walk through those doors. Liars, criminals, victims, people pretending to be something they weren't. I was just another face to him. Or at least I was supposed to be. But then his eyes landed on me. At first, nothing happened. Just a quick glance. Then a second look. His hand stopped moving. The pen froze midair. The confident expression on his face shifted into something else. Confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked a lot like fear. The courtroom clerk noticed first. Then the lawyers. One by one, people began to realize that something was wrong. Very wrong. The judge didn't speak. He didn't look away. He just stared at me, as if he had seen a ghost. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning toward me. I kept my face calm, even though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I had prepared for this moment for years, imagined it in my head more times than I could count. Still, nothing prepares you for the exact second when the truth starts pushing its way to the surface. To everyone else, I was just another ordinary person standing before the court. No special clothes. No dramatic entrance. No hint of what was coming. That was the point. I needed to look normal. Invisible even. Because the more ordinary I looked, the harder the truth would hit when it finally came out. The judge cleared his throat, but didn't say anything. He glanced down at the papers again, as if hoping the name on the page would change if he looked twice. It didn't. He looked back up at me, this time more carefully, like he was trying to connect dots that weren't supposed to exist. His voice, when he finally spoke, was lower than before. Please state your name for the record.
I did. Calm. Clear.
No emotion. Just a name. A name that meant nothing to anyone else in that room. But I saw his reaction. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that name. Or, at least, he knew something about it. Something buried deep in his memory that he had hoped would never resurface. This wasn't just a court case. It was history. Personal history. And the judge knew it. What no one else understood yet was that this moment had been building long before we ever stepped into that courtroom. Long before the case was filed. Long before the judge put on his robe that morning. Years ago, something happened. Something that changed lives, ended careers, and left scars that never fully healed. It was buried under paperwork, silence, and power. And I was living proof of it. I watched the judge struggle to regain control. He straightened his robe, shifted in his seat, and forced his professional tone back into place. But the damage was done. The freeze. The hesitation. The moment of recognition. You can't undo that. People may not have understood what it meant yet, but they felt it. The tension in the room thickened, like the air before a storm. The lawyer on the other side glanced at the judge, then at me, clearly confused. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Judges don't freeze. Judges don't lose composure. Judges don't look at someone like they're seeing a past they thought was erased. As for me, I stood there remembering the promise I made to myself a long time ago. That if I ever got the chance, I would come back. Not for revenge, not for drama, but for truth. For answers. For accountability. I didn't want the courtroom to explode. I didn't want shouting or chaos. I wanted something far more powerful. I wanted silence. Because silence forces people to think. And thinking forces memories to surface. The judge finally nodded, signaling for the proceedings to continue. On the outside, everything looked normal again. But underneath, something had cracked. I could see it in his eyes every time he glanced my way. He was trying to place me, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much I remembered, and why I was here now. What the courtroom didn't know was that this case wasn't about what was written on the papers. That was just the surface. The real story was hidden between the lines, locked behind decisions made years ago by people who believed they would never be questioned. People who believed time would protect them. They were wrong. As the hearing moved forward, every word felt heavier. Every question carried a double meaning. I answered only what I was asked, nothing more. Not yet. Timing mattered. This wasn't the moment to reveal everything. This was the moment to let doubt grow. Because once doubt enters a courtroom, it doesn't leave quietly. The judge called for a short recess. As everyone stood, he remained seated, staring straight ahead. He didn't look at me again. That told me everything I needed to know. He remembered. Maybe not all the details yet, but enough to know that I wasn't supposed to be standing there. Enough to know that the past he buried had found its way back into his courtroom. And as I walked out into the hallway, surrounded by strangers who still had no idea who I really was, I knew one thing for certain. When court resumed, nothing would be the same. Because the truth doesn't stay hidden forever. And when it finally comes out, it doesn't just change cases. It changes people. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than before, even though nothing had changed. People spoke in low voices, lawyers checked their phones. A bailiff leaned against the wall like this was just another routine day. To them, it probably was. To me, it felt like standing on the edge of something that had been buried for far too long. I took a seat on one of the wooden benches and stared at the floor, letting the noise blur together while my thoughts drifted backward. I hadn't planned to come back like this. For years, I avoided even thinking about this place, this system, and the people connected to it. Life had moved on, at least on the surface. I built a new name for myself, a new routine, a new sense of normal. But some things never truly disappear. They wait. And when the timing is right, they find their way back into your life. What brought me here wasn't anger, at least not anymore. It was a question that never stopped following me. A question that began a long time ago, on a day when I learned how easily the truth could be bent when the wrong people held power. Back then, I was younger, quieter, and far more trusting. I believed the system worked the way it was supposed to. I believed that if you told the truth, someone would listen. I learned quickly how wrong that belief was. The case from years ago was officially resolved. That's what the paperwork said.
Closed.
Final. No further action needed. But the resolution came too fast, and the silence afterward was too loud. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence went missing. Important questions were never asked in court. And the judge, this same judge, was the one who signed off on it all. At the time, I didn't connect the dots. I didn't even realize I had reason to. I was just someone caught in the middle, trying to make sense of a situation that suddenly felt bigger than me. It wasn't until much later, after distance and time gave me clarity, that I began to see the pattern. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The door to the courtroom opened, pulling me back to the present. We were being called in again. I stood, steadying myself, and followed the others inside. The judge was already back on the bench, face carefully neutral, like the earlier moment had never happened. If I hadn't seen his reaction myself, I might have believed it too. But I knew better. As the proceedings resumed, I watched him closely. Not openly, just enough to notice the small things. The way he avoided saying my name. The way he leaned back slightly whenever I spoke. The way his eyes flickered with recognition and restraint. He was trying to stay in control, and that alone told me how much the situation mattered to him. The lawyer questioning me asked about timelines, locations, and documents. Straightforward questions. Safe questions. I answered honestly but carefully. Every detail I shared was true, yet incomplete. Not because I was hiding the truth, but because the truth is layered. And some layers can only be revealed when the foundation is ready. As I spoke, memories surfaced uninvited. Long nights replaying conversations in my head. The feeling of being dismissed without explanation. The moment I realized that my version of events didn't matter to the people in charge. Back then, I felt small, replaceable, easy to overlook. That was the version of me the judge remembered, or thought he remembered.
What he didn't know was how much I had learned since then.
How much I had listened, observed, and waited. How many loose threads I had quietly gathered over the years. Not to pull them yet, just to know they existed. The courtroom remained calm, but the tension was constant. It sat between us like an unspoken agreement that something bigger was circling just out of sight. Even the other people in the room could feel it now. The lawyer paused more often. The clerk glanced up more frequently. No one said it, but everyone sensed that this case wasn't following the usual path. At one point, the judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me again. This time, there was no confusion, only caution. A silent question hung in the air between us.
Why now? Why you?
Why this case? I met his gaze without blinking. Because some stories don't end when people decide they should. The hearing continued, drifting toward technical details that seemed unimportant on the surface. But I knew better. These details were the doorway. They were the small cracks where light could eventually get in. The judge knew it too. That's why he interrupted more than once, redirecting questions, tightening the pace, keeping everything neatly contained.
Containment is a powerful thing.
It works best when everyone agrees to play along. Not everyone does. When the judge called for another pause, I felt it again, that shift in the room. Like something pressing against the walls, waiting. As people stood, I noticed his hand tremble slightly as he gathered his papers. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. I left the courtroom once more, my mind racing now, not backward but forward. I wasn't sure how long this process would take or how far it would go. What I did know was that the judge had recognized me for a reason. Whatever memory I triggered wasn't small. It wasn't harmless. It was something he had carried with him all these years, hoping it would stay buried. And now it was sitting across from him, speaking calmly into a courtroom microphone. As I waited in the hallway, I thought about the people connected to the past case, the ones who never got answers, the ones who stopped asking questions because they were told to move on. They had no idea this moment was happening. No idea that something they thought was over had quietly reopened. That was the strange part. This wasn't about exposure or shock. It was about presence. Simply being here was enough to disturb the balance. Enough to remind the judge that time doesn't erase responsibility. It only delays it. When the doors opened again, I took a deep breath and walked back inside, knowing that every step forward pulled the past closer to the surface. The truth was still hidden, still unnamed, still unresolved. But it was awake now. And so was the judge. When I stepped back into the courtroom, it felt different again. Not louder, not darker, just tighter. Like the walls had moved in a little while we were gone. Everyone returned to their places, but the energy didn't reset this time. It stayed charged, restless, as if the room itself was waiting for something to slip. The judge avoided looking at me at first. He focused on the documents, the screen, anything but my face. From his angle, he probably thought no one noticed. But people always notice when someone in power starts acting carefully. Especially when they're not used to having to. The questioning shifted direction. Now, it wasn't just about what happened recently. The lawyer began circling older details, events from years back that were technically unrelated, but close enough to matter.
Dates. Names.
Locations. Each one landed softly, but I could feel their weight. I answered slowly, letting each word settle before moving on. From the corner of my eye, I saw the judge tense. This was the edge he didn't want us to reach. I could tell he was replaying his own version of the past while listening to mine. The version where he did his job, followed procedure, signed papers, and moved on. The version where he never had to think about it again. But memory doesn't work like official records. It fills in gaps whether you want it to or not. As the questions continued, another perspective entered the room, the public defender seated a few rows away, quietly observing. She wasn't part of this case directly, but her eyes followed every exchange between me and the judge. She leaned forward slightly when the judge interrupted. She frowned when certain details were brushed aside. She knew systems. She knew patterns. And I could tell she was starting to see one. That mattered. Because conflicts like this are never just about two people. They ripple outward, touching others who begin to ask their own questions. And once that happens, control becomes harder to maintain. At one point, the lawyer asked about a meeting from years ago. A small meeting. Official on paper. Forgettable, supposedly. The judge looked up sharply. "That's not relevant," he said quickly. The lawyer paused. "With respect, Your Honor, it may be." Silence followed. Not the heavy kind from before, but a sharper one. The kind that draws lines. The judge allowed the question. I answered truthfully. I described the meeting plainly.
Who was there?
What was said? What wasn't said? I didn't add emotion. I didn't accuse. I just spoke. But even that was enough. I saw it in the way the judge pressed his lips together afterward, the way his foot shifted beneath the bench. This was no longer just about recognition. It was about exposure, not public, not yet, but internal. He was being forced to confront something he had locked away and labeled finished. From my side, the conflict felt layered. Part of me wanted to rush ahead, to pull the thread and let everything unravel. Another part knew patience was the real test. If I moved too fast, the system would close ranks. If I moved slowly, it would reveal itself. During another brief pause, I noticed someone in the back of the courtroom quietly leave. A man in a dark suit, not a lawyer, not staff. He hadn't spoken all day, but he had been listening closely. I didn't know who he was, but I knew what his departure meant. Information was moving. That knowledge added a new kind of tension. Not fear, but awareness. This story was no longer contained to the room. It was spreading, piece by piece, into places I couldn't see yet. When proceedings resumed, the judge's tone changed. He became more formal, more rigid. He stuck closely to procedure, citing rules, narrowing scope. On the surface, it looked professional. Underneath, it felt defensive, like someone reinforcing a door they suddenly realized wasn't as strong as they thought. I wondered how many times he had done this before, how many moments he had redirected, minimized, or closed off under the name of efficiency. How many people walked away from his courtroom feeling unheard, not because they were wrong, but because their truth didn't fit neatly. That thought stayed with me as I answered another question, this one about motivation.
Why, I was involved.
Why I had come forward now. The room waited. I chose my words carefully. I spoke about responsibility,
About time.
about how some things don't lose importance just because years pass. I didn't mention the judge. I didn't mention the past case directly. But everyone understood what was being said. The judge looked at me then. Really looked. And for a brief second, the authority dropped. What remained was a man measuring risk. Not legal risk alone, but personal. Reputation. Legacy. Memory. That moment told me more than any document ever could. As the session drew closer to its end, nothing was resolved. No rulings. No declarations. Just more questions left hanging, heavier than before. The judge adjourned with a firm strike of the gavel, as if sound alone could seal what was cracking open. People stood and began to file out, whispering now, glancing back. I stayed where I was for a moment, gathering myself. I felt eyes on me again, not just the judges but others. Curious, suspicious, interested. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed. Phones came out. Conversations overlapped. I caught fragments of words, unusual, recognition, history. No one had the full picture yet, but they knew a story was forming. And stories, once they start, are hard to stop. As I walked away, I didn't feel victory or relief. I felt momentum. The kind that doesn't care about comfort. The kind that pushes forward whether people are ready or not. The judge would go home that night with questions he hadn't allowed himself to ask in years. Others would start looking into things they once ignored. And me, I would keep showing up, answering only what was asked, letting the truth apply its own pressure. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had been revealed outright. But the conflict was no longer hidden. And that was enough, for now. The days that followed felt slower, heavier, like time itself was dragging its feet. News didn't break, no headlines appeared, but something was clearly moving beneath the surface. I could feel it in the way people looked at me when I returned to court. Not openly hostile. Not friendly either. Just aware. Like they knew I was connected to something they didn't fully understand yet. The judge, on the other hand, had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. He arrived earlier than usual now. Left later. He spoke less outside formal proceedings and stuck tightly to prepared language. Gone was the ease he once carried so naturally. Every decision, every pause, felt measured, calculated, careful. That told me more than words ever could. Each session peeled back another thin layer of the past. Not enough to expose anything fully, but enough to let the air in. Lawyers asked sharper questions. Records were requested that hadn't been mentioned in years. Old timelines were revisited, cross-checked, quietly compared. No one said why out loud, but the reason hovered in every exchange. Because once doubt enters a legal process, it demands attention. From another angle, I began to notice the side conversations. People speaking in corners. Staff members exchanging looks. A clerk double-checking files that had already been approved. Small things. Easy to dismiss individually. Impossible to ignore together. One afternoon, during a brief recess, the public defender approached me. She didn't introduce herself right away. She simply said, "You're very careful with your words." I nodded. I have to be. She studied my face for a moment, then lowered her voice. "So, is he?" She didn't say the judge's name. She didn't need to. That was the first time someone else acknowledged what was happening without me having to explain it. It confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't just personal anymore. Other professionals were beginning to sense that a line had been crossed long ago and quietly painted over. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. I replayed moments from years ago with new clarity. Things I once brushed off as coincidence now stood out sharply. A meeting that ended too quickly. A decision made without explanation. A file that disappeared and reappeared missing key pages. Back then, I didn't have the language to question it. Now I did. The next court session was different from the moment it began. The judge opened with a statement about procedure, tone firm but tight. His eyes avoided mine entirely. He looked like someone holding a fragile object, afraid that even a small movement might cause it to shatter. The lawyer requested to introduce a set of older records into discussion. Not evidence yet. Just context. The judge hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. That pause stretched longer than it should have. He allowed it. A murmur passed through the courtroom. As the documents were referenced, something shifted inside me. These weren't just papers. They were echoes. Proof that the past wasn't as sealed as everyone believed. Dates aligned too neatly. Signatures overlapped. Decisions followed patterns that didn't make sense unless you knew what to look for. I watched the judge's hands as he listened. One rested on the bench, fingers pressed flat. The other gripped his pen like an anchor. His face stayed neutral, but the tension showed in his jaw, in the stiffness of his posture. He was under pressure now. Not from me directly, but from the story forming around him. Outside the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed too. Conversations stopped when I passed. Some people nodded, others avoided eye contact. I overheard a whispered question once. "Do you think it's connected to that old case?" No answer followed. None was needed. The conflict was growing, stretching across time and responsibility. It wasn't about proving something yet. It was about remembering. And remembering is dangerous, when forgetting is what kept everything intact. Then came the moment that tightened everything further. During one session, the judge corrected a detail from the old case without being prompted. A small correction. Technical, but specific. Too specific. The room went quiet. The lawyer looked up. "How did you recall that detail, Your Honor?" The judge froze. Just for a second. But that second was loud. "I reviewed the file," he said quickly. But his voice lacked certainty. I felt it then, a collective realization. He remembered more than he was supposed to. More than he should have, if the case had truly meant nothing to him. The silence that followed pressed in from all sides, thick with unspoken questions. That was when I understood something important. This wasn't just about what happened years ago. It was about what had been carried forward quietly ever since. The weight of decisions made under the assumption that no one would ever come back asking why. And now someone had. As the session ended that day, the judge adjourned faster than usual. No lingering remarks. No casual exchanges. He left the bench with a stiffness that hadn't been there before. I stayed seated, letting others file out, listening to the low hum of speculation growing louder with every step. In the hallway, I caught my reflection in a glass panel. I barely recognized the person staring back. Not because I had changed, but because I finally understood why I was here. Not to accuse. Not to confront. But to witness. To stand in the same space where silence once ruled and refuse to participate in it again. The next hearing was scheduled sooner than expected. That alone sent a ripple through everyone involved. Urgency had entered the process. And urgency means something is close to the surface. As I walked away that evening, I felt the tension winding tighter, like a breath being held for too long. The judge knew it. The lawyers knew it. And now, so did everyone else watching quietly from the edges. Whatever was buried was no longer resting. It was pushing back. And when court reconvened, something was going to give. The next hearing arrived faster than anyone expected. That alone changed everything. Court schedules don't usually move like that unless something is pressing from behind the scenes. When I walked into the building that morning, I could feel it immediately. The security guard looked at my name longer than necessary. A clerk whispered to another before handing me the docket. Small signs, but clear ones. Something had shifted overnight. The courtroom filled more quickly than before. A few unfamiliar faces appeared in the gallery, people who weren't there for routine cases. Observers. Professionals. Quiet watchers who knew how to stay unnoticed while paying close attention. The tension settled early, thick and steady, like the room was holding its breath before the first word was even spoken. The judge entered without his usual confidence. His steps were measured, his expression unreadable. When he took his seat, he adjusted his robe twice, then rested both hands flat on the bench as if grounding himself.
He didn't look at me.
Not once. The proceedings began, and from the start, the questions went deeper. Not openly aggressive, but pointed, focused. The lawyer referenced timelines that overlapped too neatly with the old case. Connections that were still unofficial, still theoretical, but close enough to make everyone uneasy. I answered calmly, keeping my voice steady. Inside, my thoughts moved quickly. I could sense how close we were getting to the edge. Not over it, but near enough that one wrong step could change everything. Then something unexpected happened. A document was mentioned that hadn't been on the record before. Not entered as evidence, just acknowledged. The judge stiffened. "I don't recall that being relevant," he said. The lawyer responded carefully. "It wasn't at the time." That sentence landed hard. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Heavier. Like everyone understood the meaning beneath the words. Things change. Relevance shifts. The past doesn't stay quiet just because it was once ignored. The judge asked for a brief pause. Shorter than usual. He remained seated as others stood, scanning the room like he was measuring how much control he still had. His eyes finally met mine, and this time, there was no attempt to hide what passed between us. Recognition. And something else. Urgency. During the break, I stayed in my seat. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to give anyone the impression that I was nervous or uncertain. Across the room, I noticed the same man in the dark suit from before. He was there again, watching, expression neutral. He scribbled something in a notebook, then closed it carefully. That's when it hit me. This was no longer just about a courtroom conflict. This had reached beyond it. When the judge resumed the session, his tone was firmer, sharper. He laid out boundaries, emphasized scope, reminded everyone of procedure. It sounded like authority. It felt like containment, like someone trying to slow a current that was already moving too fast. But the questions didn't stop. The lawyer asked about decision-making processes from years ago, about discretion, about oversight. Each question was like a small tap against glass. Not enough to break it, but enough to show where the cracks were forming. At one point, the judge interrupted again. This time, his voice rose slightly. That line of questioning is speculative. The lawyer didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. For now. The phrase lingered. I could see the judge's jaw tighten. His composure was slipping in ways that couldn't be explained by a busy docket or a long day. This was personal, and everyone could feel it now. As the session pushed forward, I was asked to clarify a memory from years ago. A conversation. A brief exchange that I once thought meant nothing. I described it slowly, choosing words that were accurate but restrained. I didn't assign motives. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't have to. The judge's reaction did the work for me. He leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, as if seeing the scene unfold again in his own mind. That single reaction sent a ripple through the room. People noticed. Pens paused. Heads lifted. The silence afterward was unbearable. Then, something happened that no one expected. The judge asked me a question directly. Not procedural. Not formal. Personal. Why did you wait so long to come forward? The courtroom went completely still. This wasn't planned. This wasn't on any script. Lawyers exchanged glances, unsure whether to object. The judge realized what he had done a second too late, but the question was already out there. I took my time before answering. Because I needed to understand what I was walking into, I said. And because some truths don't surface until the moment is right. My voice didn't shake, but the room did. The judge looked away quickly, clearing his throat, regaining form. But the damage was done. That question revealed more than he intended. It showed that this wasn't just about facts. It was about fear of timing. Of what might happen when the past finally caught up. As the hearing drew toward its end, the tension became almost unbearable. No one spoke casually anymore. Every word felt deliberate, weighed, monitored. The judge adjourned with visible strain, his gavel striking harder than necessary. As people stood, the quiet buzz returned, louder than before. Whispers filled the space like static. I remained still, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle into place. Outside the courtroom, the hallway was crowded. More people than before. More eyes. Someone brushed past me and whispered, "Be careful."
I didn't turn to see who it was.
I didn't need to, because I knew we were close now. Close to something that could no longer be managed quietly. The judge knew it too. Whatever he had hoped to keep contained was pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement. That night, I felt it clearly for the first time. Not anxiety, not doubt, but inevitability. The next session would be different. The questions would be sharper. The stakes higher. The room less forgiving. And when the truth finally reached the surface, it wouldn't ask anyone for permission. The final hearing began in silence. Not the usual courtroom quiet, but the kind that feels deliberate, like everyone had agreed, without speaking, that this moment mattered. The gallery was full now. Faces I recognized, faces I didn't. The quiet observers were no longer pretending to blend in. They sat openly, notebooks ready, eyes sharp. The judge entered last. He looked different, tired but resolved. Whatever decision he had made, he had already made it before stepping into the room. He took his seat, paused, and for the first time since this all began, looked directly at me without hesitation. The proceedings opened with a request the room had been waiting for. A formal review. Not a dramatic announcement. Just a measured statement entered into the record. A review of past decisions connected to the earlier case. The judge's voice remained steady as he allowed it, but there was no mistaking the weight behind the words. This was the door finally opening. The lawyer laid everything out carefully. Timelines aligned. Records once considered final were re-examined. Missing documents were acknowledged. Inconsistencies that once lived quietly in footnotes were spoken out loud. No accusations yet. Just facts, placed side by side until their meaning could no longer be ignored.
I was called to speak one last time.
I stood, feeling the room close and around me. Not threatening, expectant. I spoke about what it felt like to live with unanswered questions. about how silence can feel like a decision being made over and over again. I explained why coming back wasn't about rewriting the past, but about finally naming it. As I spoke, I noticed something strange. The judge wasn't avoiding my gaze anymore. He listened closely, nodding slightly at moments no one else seemed to notice. When I finished, he took a breath that sounded heavier than anything he'd said all day. Then he did something no one expected. He spoke, not as a judge issuing a ruling, but as a man addressing the record. He acknowledged the past case, acknowledged that it had been handled within the limits of procedure at the time, but not within the spirit of justice. He admitted that pressure, influence, and haste had shaped decisions that should have been questioned more deeply. The courtroom stayed silent, stunned by the honesty. Responsibility was named. Not dramatically. Not defensively. Clearly. The conflict that had lived under the surface for years finally had air. The judge ordered the case reopened for independent review and stepped back from any further involvement. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, final and unmistakable. It wasn't a victory speech. It wasn't an ending wrapped in certainty. But it was resolution. People began to move, whispering, reacting, processing. I remained still, feeling something loosen inside me that I didn't realize I'd been carrying for so long. Answers wouldn't come instantly. Accountability takes time. But the truth had crossed the threshold. As I turned to leave, I felt it, the release. The story had shifted from secrecy to record, from silence to acknowledgement. Then came the twist. Just as I reached the courtroom doors, a voice stopped me. Wait. It was the man in the dark suit. Up close, he introduced himself quietly. Not media. Not legal counsel. Internal oversight. He spoke calmly, but his words landed hard. You should know, he said, the review didn't start because of your testimony. I froze. He explained that months before I ever filed my appearance, an anonymous report had triggered a background audit. Quiet. Preliminary. Easy to miss. My arrival hadn't started the process. It had accelerated it. I asked the only question that mattered. Who filed it? He hesitated, then answered. The judge. The realization hit all at once. The recognition. The tension. The fear, not of exposure, but of timing. The judge hadn't frozen because he saw me as a threat. He froze because he already knew the truth was coming. He had seen it closing in and chose, at the last moment, not to outrun it. I walked out of the building into open air, the weight of the day settling behind me. The conflict was resolved, but the story wasn't finished. Reviews would follow. Records would change. Lives would shift in quiet, lasting ways. And the judge? He had done the one thing no one expected. He didn't wait to be exposed. He stepped aside and let the truth arrive on its own terms. That was the part no one saw coming. And that was the part that would stay with me the longest. I walked away from the courthouse slowly, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to rush the feeling. The noise of the city returned in pieces. Cars passing, distant voices, footsteps on concrete. Life moving forward like it always does. Yet something inside me had finally come to a stop. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying a question with no answer. I wasn't wondering if the truth mattered. I had seen with my own eyes that it did. In the weeks that followed, the courtroom drama faded from public attention, just as I expected it would. There were no viral headlines, no loud debates. That was never the point. What mattered happened quietly, inside official rooms and long meetings, where records were reviewed and timelines rebuilt. The reopened case moved forward under independent oversight, exactly as promised. Slowly, carefully, the way it should have been done the first time. People reached out to me in unexpected ways. A former clerk sent a short message saying they were relieved someone finally spoke. A lawyer I barely knew thanked me for my patience. Even the public defender I had noticed earlier stopped me one afternoon and said, "You reminded people why this work matters." Those words stayed with me more than any formal outcome. As for the judge, he disappeared from the public courtroom almost overnight. No statements. No interviews. Just a quiet withdrawal from the role he had carried for so long. Some people criticized him. Others defended him. I didn't do either. What he did at the end didn't erase the past, but it changed the future. And sometimes, that's the most honest form of accountability. I thought a lot about that moment when he froze, when our eyes met, and everything shifted. At the time, it felt like power changing hands. Looking back, I realized it was something else. It was recognition, not just of me, but of responsibility. Of a truth that had waited patiently until someone was willing to face it. The reopened case brought answers, but not all of them came in neat lines. Some questions led to more questions. Some outcomes were quieter than expected. That's how justice usually works in real life. It's rarely dramatic. It's layered, slow, and human. But it was real. And that mattered. One of the biggest lessons I took from the experience was how much silence shapes outcomes. Not just in courtrooms, but everywhere. Silence can protect people, but it can also trap them. For years, I thought staying quiet was the safest choice. I told myself it was practical, that moving on meant leaving things behind. What I learned is that silence doesn't disappear, it waits. And when it finally breaks, it does so with weight. I also learned that truth doesn't always arrive the way we imagine. Sometimes it doesn't come with confrontation or victory. Sometimes it arrives through restraint, timing, and the refusal to be rushed. Showing up, speaking carefully, and letting facts stand on their own turned out to be more powerful than anything else I could have done. Life didn't change overnight after that. I still went back to my routine. I still had responsibilities, plans, ordinary worries. But something fundamental had shifted. The story I carried for so long no longer belonged only to me. It had a place in the record now. A place where it couldn't be ignored or erased. Every now and then, I think about the people who never get that chance. The ones whose stories stay buried because the timing never feels right, or because the system feels too big to challenge. If there's one thing I hope stays with anyone hearing the story, it's this. The truth doesn't require permission to exist. It only requires someone willing to stand with it long enough. The courtroom that once felt heavy and intimidating now feels distant. Not because it lost its power, but because I no longer feel small inside it. That change didn't come from winning anything. It came from being heard. And maybe that's the real ending. Not a dramatic ruling. Not a shocking confession. But a quiet moment where the truth is finally acknowledged and the people involved are left to carry it forward honestly. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a door opening that stayed closed for far too long. As I move on from this chapter, I don't carry anger with me. I carry clarity. I know now that even the most controlled spaces can be changed by patience, presence, and truth. And I know that when the past finally catches up, it doesn't always come to punish. Sometimes it comes to correct. That day in court started with a judge freezing in his seat. It ended with something far more powerful than shock. It ended with accountability. And that's a story worth telling.